The explosion threw Sophia Mitchell face first into the mud, her ears ringing as chunks of concrete rained down around her. Through the smoke and chaos, she could hear the screams of wounded soldiers, the rattling of automatic gunfire, and somewhere in the distance, the rumbling of enemy tanks advancing on their position. "Mitchell, status report." Colonel Barnes's voice crackled through her damaged radio, barely audible over the din of battle. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sophia pushed herself up, spitting dirt and blood from her split lip. Around her, the remnants of Delta Company lay scattered across the bombed-out courtyard of what had once been a school in the war-torn city of Kandahar province. Bodies in desert camouflage uniforms sprawled motionless between overturned vehicles and chunks of rubble. The acrid smell of cordite and burning fuel filled her nostrils. "Sir, we've lost at least 12 Kia, maybe more," she reported, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Enemy forces have overrun our eastern perimeter. We're completely cut off." Static answered her for several heartbeats. When Barnes's voice returned, it carried the weight of a man making an impossible decision. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I'm ordering you to fall back to Rally Point Bravo. Leave the wounded behind." Sophia's blood ran cold. She looked around at the soldiers who had trusted her to bring them home, Martinez clutching his shattered leg, crying for his mother. Thompson trying to hold his intestines inside his torn abdomen. Williams, barely 19, staring sightlessly at the sky with a hole in his chest the size of a dinner plate. These weren't just soldiers under her command. They were kids who had followed her into hell because they believed she would get them out alive. "Sir, I need you to repeat that order," she said, knowing full well she had heard him correctly. "Fall back, Lieutenant. That's a direct order. You cannot save them all." Through the smoke, Sophia could see the silhouettes of enemy soldiers advancing. Through the rubble, their AK-47s glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. In 30 seconds, maybe less, they would be in range to finish off the wounded. Her own rifle lay somewhere in the debris, but she still had her sidearm and 2 grenades clipped to her vest. The smart play was obvious. Follow orders, retreat, live to fight another day. Save herself and whatever able-bodied soldiers remained. It was the logical choice, the one that would keep her alive and preserve what was left of their fighting force. Instead, Lieutenant Sophia Mitchell made the decision that would define not just her career, but the woman she would become. "Negative, Colonel. We don't leave our people behind." She switched to the company frequency, her voice cutting through the chaos with crystalline clarity. "All Delta personnel, this is Mitchell. We're moving to defensive positions around the wounded. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody." 6 months earlier, Lieutenant Sophia Mitchell had been nothing more than another face in the crowd at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. At 26, she was older than most junior officers, having worked her way through college and ROTC, while supporting her younger siblings after their parents died in a car accident. The other lieutenants, fresh out of West Point or straight from officer candidate school, viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed condescension. "Mitchell's got heart," she'd overheard Captain Rodriguez telling another officer in the mess hall. "But heart doesn't make you a leader. These kids need someone they can look up to, not someone who looks like their little sister." Standing 5'4", in boots and weighing barely 130 pounds soaking wet, Sophia had learned early that she would have to work twice as hard to earn half the respect her male counterparts received automatically. Her performance reviews were consistently excellent, her physical fitness scores ranked in the top 5% of her class, and her tactical knowledge was encyclopedic. None of it seemed to matter. "You're too soft," Major Patterson had told her during her last evaluation. "Leadership isn't about being liked. It's about making hard decisions that other people are too weak to make. Until you understand that, You'll never be more than a competent follower." The words had stung because part of her worried they might be true. In the sterile environment of training exercises and war games, she had excelled. But would she have what it took when lives hung in the balance? When the bullets were real and the consequences permanent? Her assignment to Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, 173rd Airborne Brigade had come through just as the unit was preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. She would be replacing Lieutenant Morrison, who had been killed by an IED 3 weeks into the deployment. The unofficial word was that morale was shot, discipline was breaking down, and the company commander, Captain James Sullivan, was looking for someone expendable to take over the platoon. Until a more experienced officer became available. Sophia arrived at Forward Operating Base Chapman on a sweltering August morning, her uniform already soaked with sweat before she'd even left the transport plane. The base sprawled across several acres of dusty ground, surrounded by concrete blast walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, their occupants scanning the surrounding mountains for signs of enemy movement. She found Delta Company's quarters in a cluster of prefabricated buildings near the eastern edge of the base. The soldiers were lounging in whatever shade they could find, their weapons within arm's reach, but their attention focused on card games, letters from home, or simply staring into the middle distance with the 1,000-yard stare that came from too much combat and too little sleep. "You must be the new LT," said a voice behind her. She turned to find a bear of a man approaching, his sergeant's stripes visible on his dust-covered uniform. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a wounded soldier and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. His dark skin was weathered by years of desert sun, and his eyes held the kind of weary intelligence that came from keeping young soldiers alive in impossible circumstances. "Sergeant Williams, I presume?" Sophia extended her hand, which disappeared completely in his massive grip. "That's right, ma'am. Been holding things together since Lieutenant Morrison." He paused, his expression darkening slightly. "Well, since we lost him. The men are good soldiers, but they've been through hell. Lost a lot of friends." Sophia nodded, studying the faces around her. Most of the soldiers appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, though their eyes held an age that had nothing to do with chronology. She recognized the look from her own mirror after her parents' funeral, the hollow expression of people who had seen too much too young. "How many men in the platoon currently?" 28 effectives, ma'am. We started with 35, but Williams gestured vaguely toward the mountains surrounding the base. "War's expensive." One of the soldiers, a lanky kid with corporal stripes and a thick Brooklyn accent, looked up from his card game. "Yo, Sarge, this our new babysitter?" The casual disrespect hung in the air like smoke. Williams's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Sophia stepped forward. The young corporal, his name tape read Rodriguez, was maybe 20 years old, with intelligent eyes and the kind of cocky smile that suggested he'd been getting by on charm and quick thinking his whole life. "Corporal Rodriguez, isn't it?" Sophia's voice was calm, conversational. "I understand you're from New York?" Rodriguez blinked, apparently surprised by the friendly tone. "Yeah, LT, Brooklyn born and raised. I spent a summer there during college," Sophia continued, moving closer to his group. "Worked construction in Queens. Learned a lot about respect from the guys on that crew. They taught me that respect isn't something you're entitled to, it's something you earn, every day." She crouched down next to Rodriguez's group, bringing herself to eye level with the seated soldiers. "They also taught me that smart-ass comments are like cheap cologne. A little goes a long way, and too much makes everyone around you want to get some fresh air." A few of the other soldiers snickered, and Rodriguez had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "No disrespect intended, ma'am." "None taken," Sophia replied, standing back up. "But next time you want to test the new lieutenant, Maybe wait until she's had a chance to disappoint you first. Fair enough?" Rodriguez grinned and nodded. "Fair enough, Alti." Williams looked impressed despite himself. Over the next few hours, as Sophia made her rounds and introduced herself to the rest of the platoon, she began to get a sense of the unit's dynamics. The soldiers were competent and experienced, but they moved with the careful detachment of people who had learned not to get too attached to anything or anyone that might disappear without warning. Private First Class Elena Martinez was the unit's medic, a compact woman with steady hands and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded Sophia of her own younger sister. She had enlisted after her pre-med boyfriend was killed in Iraq, determined to save lives rather than lose them. Specialist David Chun handled communications, his technical expertise invaluable in coordinating with other units and calling in air support. Despite his quiet demeanor, the other soldiers clearly respected his judgment and often sought his advice on matters that had nothing to do with radio procedures. Corporal Anthony Tank Johnson earned his nickname through his skill with the squad's M249 light machine gun, which he carried like other men might carry a briefcase. At barely 21, he had already seen more combat than many career soldiers, and his steady presence in firefights had saved countless lives. Private Samuel Thompson was the youngest member of the unit at 19, fresh-faced and eager despite the circumstances that had brought him here. The other soldiers had adopted him as a kind of little brother, simultaneously protecting and tormenting him in the way that only military families could manage. As the days passed, Sophia threw herself into learning everything she could about her new command. She studied maps of the local area, memorizing terrain features and potential ambush sites. She reviewed after-action reports from previous missions, looking for patterns and lessons learned. Most importantly, she spent time with her soldiers, learning their strengths, weaknesses, and the complex web of relationships that bound them together. The first test came 2 weeks after her arrival, when Captain Sullivan announced that Delta Company would be conducting a series of patrol operations in the villages surrounding the base. Intelligence suggested that insurgent forces were using the area to smuggle weapons and coordinate attacks on coalition forces. "Your job is to show the flag and gather intelligence," Sullivan told the assembled platoon leaders during the briefing. "Hearts and minds, people. We want the locals to see us as protectors, not occupiers." Sophia studied the map, noting the proximity of known insurgent safe houses to the villages they would be patrolling. The area was a maze of narrow streets and mud brick buildings, perfect terrain for ambushes and improvised explosive devices. "Sir," she raised her hand, "what's our rules of engagement if we encounter hostile forces?" Sullivan's expression suggested. He found the question irritating. "Standard row, Lieutenant. You're authorized to defend yourself and your soldiers, but I want minimal civilian casualties. The last thing we need is another international incident, because some trigger-happy soldier couldn't tell the difference between a farmer and a fighter." After the briefing, Williams approached Sophia with a concerned expression. "Ma'am, sir, you need to see this," he said, offering Sullivan a decoded message intercept. "We've been monitoring insurgent communications, and they're planning something big." Sullivan took the message, his expression darkening as he read. After a moment, he passed it to Sophia. The intelligence was fragmentary but alarming references to a major operation targeting coalition forces, mentions of weapons shipments from Pakistan, and coordination between multiple insurgent cells that had previously operated independently. "When?" Sophia asked. "Best estimate is within the next 2 weeks, Chun replied. "They're using code words we haven't seen before, but the context suggests they're planning multiple simultaneous attacks." Sullivan reached for his phone to contact battalion headquarters while Sophia studied the intercept more carefully. The language patterns and tactical references suggested involvement by foreign fighters, experienced jihadists who had honed their skills in Iraq, Chechnya, and other theaters of conflict. "This isn't just another harassment operation," she told Sullivan after he finished his phone call. "They're planning something that will require significant coordination and resources." "My thoughts exactly." "Colonel Barnes wants all company commanders for an emergency briefing at 2100 hours. I want you there as well. Your recent intelligence gathering makes you our resident expert on enemy capabilities in this sector." The battalion briefing revealed the scope of the threat facing coalition forces in the region. Intelligence from multiple sources indicated that insurgent forces were planning coordinated attacks on forward operating base Chapman and 2 smaller outposts, with the goal of inflicting maximum casualties and capturing coalition prisoners for propaganda purposes. Best intelligence suggests enemy strength of 300 to 400 fighters, Colonel Barnes announced to the assembled officers. They've been infiltrating the area over the past month, using established smuggling routes to avoid detection. 400 fighters represented the largest insurgent force that coalition units in the region had faced since the initial invasion. The implications were staggering. If successful, such an attack could destabilize the entire province and force a major reassessment of coalition strategy. "What's our response?" asked Major Harrison, the battalion's executive officer. "We're going to hit them first," Barnes replied grimly. "Intelligence has identified 3 primary staging areas where enemy forces are concentrating. We'll conduct simultaneous air and ground attacks to disrupt their preparations and degrade their combat effectiveness." As Barnes outlined the operation, Sophia realized that Delta Company would be assigned to assault the largest and most heavily defended staging area. The mission would require her platoon to helicopter insert into hostile territory, fight their way through prepared defensive positions, and hold the objective until reinforcements arrived. It was exactly the kind of high-risk mission that had historically been given to elite units like Army Rangers or Special Forces. The fact that it was being assigned to her platoon suggested either tremendous confidence in their abilities or a willingness to accept significant casualties in pursuit of the mission objectives. "Questions?" Barnes asked after completing the briefing. Sophia raised her hand. "Sir, what's the estimated enemy strength in our assigned objective?" "Intelligence suggests company strength forces, possibly reinforced. Call it 120 to 150 fighters, with crew-served weapons and prepared positions." The math was sobering. Her 28-soldier platoon would be attacking a position defended by 5 times their number, with limited support and no possibility of withdrawal if things went wrong. "Time hack is 0300 tomorrow," Barnes continued. "I want all units ready to move by 0200. This operation has been designated Priority Alpha by Division Headquarters, which means we get all available air support and artillery. Use it wisely." As the briefing broke up, Sullivan pulled Sophia aside for a private conversation. "Lieutenant, I'm not going to lie to you, this is a shit mission. The kind of assignment that either makes careers or ends them. Are your soldiers ready for this?" Sophia thought about the men who had followed her up that mountain, who had charged enemy positions because they trusted her judgment. "They're ready, sir. Question is whether I am." "You are," Sullivan said with surprising conviction. "I've seen a lot of officers come and go in 20 years of service. Most of them are competent administrators who can follow orders and manage paperwork. But every once in a while, you encounter someone who has that indefinable quality that makes soldiers willing to follow them into hell. You have that quality, Mitchell. The question is what you're going to do with it." That night, Sophia gathered her platoon for what she knew might be their final briefing together. In the harsh light of the briefing tent, their faces looked impossibly young kids who should have been in college or starting careers, not preparing to assault a heavily fortified enemy position at dawn. "Gentlemen," she began, "tomorrow we're going to do something that military historians will either call brilliant or completely insane. We're going to attack a position defended by 5 times our number, in terrain that favors the defense, against enemies who have had weeks to prepare their positions. Rodriguez, his Brooklyn accent carrying a note of dark humor, raised his hand. LT, just to be clear, this is the pep talk, right? Because it's not exactly boosting my confidence. The comment broke the tension, and several soldiers chuckled. Sophia smiled, grateful for Rodriguez's ability to find humor in even the darkest situations. Here's what I want you to remember, she continued. We've trained for this. We've fought together before, and we've proven that we can accomplish the impossible when we work as a team. But more than that, we're not just fighting for mission, objectives, or tactical advantages. We're fighting for each other. She looked around at each face in turn, seeing the mixture of fear and determination that she had come to recognize as the mark of professional soldiers preparing for combat. I won't lie to you, tomorrow is going to be the hardest thing any of us has ever done. Some of us might not make it home. But if we do our jobs, if we support each other, we can accomplish something that will save lives and make a real difference in this war. Williams, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke. Ma'am, speaking for the platoon, we've got your back. Whatever happens tomorrow, we go together. The unanimous nods and murmured agreements from around the tent confirmed what Sophia already knew: these soldiers would follow her anywhere, even into what might be certain death. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. After dismissing the platoon to make their final preparations, Sophia found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time in days. She pulled out a piece of paper and began writing letters, one to each of her siblings, explaining how proud she was of them and how much they meant to her. Letters that would only be sent if she didn't survive the next day's operation. It was a ritual that soldiers had performed before battles throughout history, a way of making peace with mortality, while preparing to do their duty regardless of the consequences. As she sealed the letters and handed them to the battalion chaplain for safekeeping, Sophia felt a strange sense of calm descend over her. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, she would focus on the mission and the soldiers who were counting on her leadership. The helicopter insertion began at 0300 under cover of darkness, with 2 Black Hawk aircraft carrying her platoon toward the target area. Through her night vision goggles, Sophia could see the mountainous terrain passing below them, a landscape of shadows and stark beauty that had witnessed countless battles throughout Afghanistan's turbulent history. 2 minutes, the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise. Sophia checked her weapon one final time and looked around at her soldiers. They were locked and loaded, their faces painted with camouflage and their expressions set with grim determination. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she was proud to serve with them. Remember the plan, she called out as the helicopters began their final approach. Fast insertion, immediate assault on the primary objective, hold until reinforcements arrive. The landing zone was a flat area roughly 500 meters from the enemy position, chosen to minimize the helicopter's exposure to ground fire while giving the assault force room to organize before beginning their attack. As the Black Hawks flared for landing, Sophia could see muzzle flashes in the distance. The enemy was already engaging the aircraft with small arms fire. Go, 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 she shouted as the helicopters touched down. Her soldiers poured out of the aircraft with practiced efficiency, immediately forming defensive perimeters while the helicopters lifted off and disappeared into the darkness. Within 30 seconds, they were alone in enemy territory, completely dependent on their training, their weapons, and their trust in each other. Movement to our front, Thompson called out, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of gunfire. Through her night vision, Sophia could see figures moving in the rocks ahead, enemy sentries, responding to the helicopter insertion. The element of surprise was gone, which meant they would have to fight their way to the objective against fully alerted defenders. Williams, take your squad and flank around to the south. Rodriguez, you're with me on the direct assault. Johnson, establish overwatch and suppress any crew-served weapons. The assault that followed was a textbook example of small unit tactics, executed under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Sophia's soldiers advanced through the rocky terrain with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from months of training and combat experience. Enemy resistance was fierce and well organized. Insurgent fighters had established interlocking fields of fire from prepared positions, and their use of crew-served weapons forced the advancing soldiers to take cover repeatedly. But Sophia's tactical planning and her soldiers' aggressive execution gradually overcame the defensive advantages. "RPG team at 2 o'clock. Rodriguez shouted, engaging the enemy crew with accurate rifle fire. Johnson's machine gun chattered steadily from his overwatch position, its heavy bullets keeping enemy fighters pinned in their fighting positions while assault teams maneuvered closer. Shun coordinated artillery support with the calm professionalism that had become his trademark, walking high-explosive rounds steadily closer to enemy positions. The breakthrough came when Williams's flanking force reached the enemy's left flank, catching the insurgent fighters by surprise and forcing them to divide their attention between multiple threats. The tactical advantage allowed Sophia's direct assault force to close the final 100 meters and begin clearing enemy positions with grenades and close-quarters combat. What followed was the kind of brutal, face-to-face fighting that soldiers train for but hope never to experience. In the confined space of fighting positions and bunkers, tactical advantages mattered less than individual courage and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect the soldier next to you. Rodriguez found himself locked in hand-to-hand combat with an enemy fighter, their rifles forgotten as they grappled for a knife that would determine who lived and who died. Thompson, despite his wounded arm from the previous engagement, single-handedly cleared 3 enemy positions with grenades and sheer determination. Through it all, Sophia moved among her soldiers like a force of nature, coordinating the assault. While engaging enemy fighters with her rifle and sidearm, she pulled wounded soldiers to safety, redistributed ammunition, and made the split-second tactical decisions that kept the assault moving forward, despite horrific casualties. When the shooting finally stopped 47 minutes after it began, Sophia's platoon controlled the objective and had taken more than 60 enemy fighters prisoner. The intelligence value of the captured personnel and equipment would prove enormous, providing coalition forces with detailed information about insurgent organization, financing, and future operational plans. But the victory had come at a terrible price. The casualty count was devastating. 7 soldiers from Sophia's platoon were dead, including Corporal Rodriguez, whose quick wit and Brooklyn charm had kept morale high during the darkest moments of their deployment. Another 12 were wounded, some critically, leaving only 9 soldiers capable of continued combat operations. Sophia knelt beside Rodriguez's body, her hands shaking as she closed his eyes and whispered a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. Around her, the other survivors were performing this same grim ritual, saying goodbye to friends who had become family over months of shared danger and hardship. "Ma'am," William said quietly, his own voice thick with emotion, "we need to establish a defensive perimeter and call for medevac. The wounded need immediate medical attention." Through her grief, Sophia forced herself back into command mode. Her surviving soldiers needed leadership now more than ever, and wallowing in guilt over the casualties would help no one. She keyed her radio and began coordinating with headquarters for helicopter extraction of the wounded and reinforcement of their position. The successful assault had achieved its tactical objectives, but the strategic implications were more complex. Intelligence recovered from the enemy position revealed that the planned insurgent offensive was even larger than coalition forces had suspected. Rather than the coordinated attacks on 3 bases that they had prepared for, enemy forces were planning a sustained campaign designed to drive coalition forces out of the entire province. "This changes everything," Colonel Barnes told Sophia during the post-mission debriefing. The enemy force structure is more sophisticated than we realized. They've got communications equipment, logistics support, and coordination that suggests significant external assistance. The captured documents painted a picture of an insurgent organization that operated more like a conventional military force than the loose network of tribal fighters that intelligence analysts had assumed they were facing. There were organizational charts, supply schedules, and operational plans that demonstrated levels of planning and resources that required substantial backing. "What does this mean for our mission here?" Sophia asked. "It means we're not just fighting local insurgents anymore. We're dealing with a proxy force that has been trained, equipped, and supported by our enemies. The rules of the game have changed, and we need to adapt our tactics accordingly." Over the next several days, as Sophia's surviving soldiers recovered from their wounds and mourned their fallen comrades, she began to see the broader implications of their discovery. The enemy they were facing was not a ragtag collection of disgruntled locals, but a well-organized military force with clear strategic objectives and the resources to achieve them. The realization forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about their mission in Afghanistan. Were they really winning hearts and minds, or were they simply holding territory while a more sophisticated enemy prepared for a prolonged campaign? Were the tactical victories they had achieved meaningful, or were they just temporary setbacks for an enemy that could absorb casualties and continue fighting? The questions became more pressing when intelligence reports began arriving from other sectors. Coalition forces throughout the region were facing larger, better organized insurgent attacks. The pattern suggested a coordinated campaign that went far beyond the local grievances that had historically driven resistance to foreign forces in Afghanistan. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Captain Sullivan said during one of their planning sessions, "I'm recommending you for promotion to captain in assignment. As my executive officer, your tactical judgment and leadership under fire have been exceptional, and I need someone I can trust to help plan our response to this new threat." The promotion was flattering, but it would also mean leaving her platoon at a time when they needed experienced leadership more than ever. The survivors of Delta Company's 3rd Platoon were traumatized by their losses and struggling to maintain the unit cohesion that had made them so effective. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but my soldiers need me right now. We've been through hell together, and I don't want to abandon them when they're trying to rebuild." Sullivan's expression suggested he had expected that response. "Mitchell, you need to think bigger picture. The skills that make you effective at the platoon level are exactly what we need at the company and battalion level. Your soldiers will be fine. They're professionals who understand that the mission comes first." But Sophia wasn't sure that was true. In the days following the assault, she had watched her surviving soldiers struggle with survivor's guilt, questioning whether they could have done more to save their fallen comrades. The tight-knit unit that had once functioned like a family was fragmenting under the weight of loss and trauma. Private Thompson, barely 20 years old, had become withdrawn and jumpy, flinching at unexpected sounds and avoiding the areas of the base where his dead friends had spent their time. Specialist Chun, normally unflappable, had begun making small errors in his communications procedures, mistakes that could prove fatal in combat situations. Even Staff Sergeant Williams, the rock-solid foundation of the platoon, showed signs of strain. He had begun drinking heavily during off-duty hours and had gotten into several altercations with soldiers from other units. The steady leadership that had held the platoon together was cracking under pressure. "We need to talk," Sophia told Williams. After finding him drinking alone in his quarters one evening, Williams looked up with bloodshot eyes, his normally immaculate uniform wrinkled and stained. "What's to talk about, ma'am? We did our job, completed the mission, and got half our people killed in the process. Sounds like a typical Army success story to me." The bitterness in his voice was unlike anything Sophia had heard from him before. Williams had always been the consummate professional soldier, someone who understood that casualties or an inevitable part of combat operations. To see him struggling with doubt and guilt was deeply unsettling. "Sergeant, we saved lives with that mission. The intelligence we captured has allowed other units to interdict weapons shipments and prevent attacks on coalition bases. Our soldiers didn't die for nothing." "Tell that to Rodriguez's mother when she gets the flag," Williams replied, taking another drink from his bottle. "Tell that to Johnson's kids when they ask why Daddy isn't coming home. Tell that to all the AV families who are going to spend the rest of their lives wondering if their loved ones would still be alive if their lieutenant had made different tactical decisions." The accusation hung in the air between them like poison gas. Sophia had been torturing herself with the same questions since the assault, wondering if there had been alternative approaches that might have achieved the same objectives with fewer casualties. "You think I made the wrong call?" Williams was quiet for a long moment, staring into his bottle as if it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "I think you made the call that needed to be made at the time, with the information you had available. But that doesn't make it easier to live with the consequences." Over the next week, similar conversations played out with other members of the platoon. Each soldier processed their grief and trauma differently, but the common thread was a sense that something fundamental had changed. The easy camaraderie that had characterized their unit was gone, replaced by a weight of shared loss that made every interaction feel forced and artificial. The situation came to a head when Thompson was found unconscious in his quarters after taking an overdose of pain medication prescribed for his wounded arm. The suicide attempt shocked everyone, including soldiers from other units who had looked up to Delta Company as an example of military professionalism and effectiveness. "This is what happens when you push soldiers too hard," Major Patterson told Sophia during an informal counseling session. "These kids aren't machines. They're human beings with limits, and when those limits are exceeded, they break." Sophia wanted to argue, to defend the tactical decisions that had led to their current situation, but the words wouldn't come. Thompson was alive thanks to quick action by his roommate and the base medical staff, but his attempt had shattered any illusions about the psychological state of her surviving soldiers. "Maybe you were right," she told Patterson. "Maybe I am too soft to make the hard decisions that leadership requires." "No," Patterson replied firmly. "You're exactly the kind of leader these soldiers need. But you're trying to carry all of their pain along with your own, and that's not sustainable. You need to find a way to help them process their grief while still maintaining the unit cohesion necessary for continued operations." The advice was sound, but implementing it proved more challenging than Sophia had anticipated. Traditional military approaches to dealing with combat stress-keeping soldiers, busy with training and missions, weren't working with troops who had been pushed beyond their psychological limits. Instead, she began holding informal counseling sessions where soldiers could talk about their experiences and feelings without fear of being judged or labeled as weak. She arranged for visits from military chaplains and mental health professionals, and she worked with the base commander to modify their operational tempo to allow more recovery time. Most importantly, she began sharing her own struggles with doubt and guilt, letting her soldiers see that their commanding officer was human, rather than the invincible figure they had projected onto her. "I wake up every night wondering if there was something I could have done differently," she told them during one of their group sessions. "I second-guess every tactical decision, every order I gave, every moment when I might have saved a life. If I had been smarter or faster or better prepared." The admission of vulnerability had a profound impact on her soldiers. For months, they had followed someone they saw as supremely confident and capable, never realizing that she struggled with the same fears and doubts that plagued them. Seeing her human side gave them permission to acknowledge their own psychological wounds and begin the process of healing. Recovery was slow and uneven. Some soldiers responded well to counseling and gradually regained their emotional equilibrium. Others required more intensive treatment and were eventually reassigned to non-combat roles. A few, including Thompson, were medically evacuated to facilities in Germany and eventually the United States for long-term psychological care. But slowly, the survivors began to coalesce into something resembling a functional unit again. New soldiers arrived to replace those who had been lost or reassigned, bringing fresh energy and different perspectives to the platoon. The veterans who remained took on mentorship roles, sharing their hard-won experience with the new arrivals, while carefully avoiding the kind of emotional attachment that had made their previous losses so devastating. Sophia found herself changed by the experience as well. The confident young officer who had arrived in Afghanistan 6 months earlier had been replaced by someone who understood the true cost of leadership in combat. She was more cautious in her tactical decision-making, more attuned to the psychological state of her soldiers, and more aware of the weight of responsibility that came with command. The change was noticed by her superiors as well. Colonel Barnes, who had previously viewed her as a promising but inexperienced officer, began including her in strategic planning sessions and seeking her input on operations throughout the battalion's area of responsibility. "You've matured as a leader," he told her during one of their meetings. "Combat has a way of separating those who can handle the responsibility from those who can't. You've proven that you belong in the first category." But with that recognition came new challenges and greater expectations. The enemy forces they were facing had continued to evolve, using the intelligence gathered from coalition operations to adapt their tactics and improve their effectiveness. What had begun as a counterinsurgency operation was gradually becoming something resembling conventional warfare, with organized enemy forces capable of sustained operations against coalition bases and supply lines. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy commanders were planning a major offensive designed to overrun Forward Operating Base Chapman and several smaller outposts simultaneously. The attack would involve more than 1,000 fighters, supported by heavy weapons and coordinated artillery strikes. "This isn't just another raid," Barnes explained during an emergency briefing. "They're planning to take and hold territory, establishing a zone of control that they can use as a base for further operations." The implications were staggering. If successful, such an operation would represent the most significant insurgent victory since the initial invasion of Afghanistan. It would also likely result in hundreds of coalition casualties and could force a major strategic reassessment of the entire mission. "What's our response?" Sullivan asked. "We're going to hit them first," Barnes replied. "But this time, we're not talking about a single company-level assault. Division is committing an entire brigade to this operation, with supporting artillery and close air support. We're going to crush this insurgent force before they can launch their offensive." As Barnes outlined the operation, Sophia realized that her company would be assigned a crucial role in the assault. They would be responsible for seizing and holding a key terrain feature that controlled the main approaches to the enemy's defensive positions. Success would allow follow-on forces to exploit the breakthrough and destroy the insurgent army. Failure would result in the collapse of the entire operation. The mission requires a company-level assault against prepared positions, defended by at least 300 fighters, Barnes continued. "It's going to be the toughest fight any of us has seen in this deployment." Sophia looked around at the other officers in the briefing room, seeing a mixture of determination and apprehension in their faces. They were all professional soldiers who understood that this kind of large-scale combat operation was exactly what they had trained for throughout their careers. But they also understood that operations of this scope and complexity were where military careers were made or ended, where tactical decisions had strategic implications, and where the margin for error was virtually non-existent. "Questions?" Barnes asked. Captain Sullivan raised his hand. "Sir, what's the timeline for this operation?" 72 hours, Barnes replied grimly. "Intelligence suggests the enemy offensive will begin within the week. We need to strike before they're fully prepared. 3 days to plan and execute the largest combat operation in the region's recent history. 3 days to coordinate air support, artillery fires, and the movement of more than 3,000 soldiers across difficult terrain. 3 days to prepare for a battle that would determine the future of coalition operations in Afghanistan. As the briefing ended, and officers began discussing the tactical details of their assigned missions, Sophia felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that preceded major combat operations. Everything she had learned about leadership, tactics, and herself would be tested in the crucible of battle. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever before. The operation began with what military planners euphemistically called proper array. Fires, a sustained artillery bombardment, designed to soften enemy defenses and disrupt their command and control systems. For 47 minutes, high explosive rounds rained down on suspected enemy positions, while Apache gunships prowled the battlefield, engaging targets of opportunity with Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon fire. From her position, 3 kilometers away, Sophia watched the fireworks display through binoculars while making final preparations for her company's assault. The bombardment was impressive by any standard. Geysers of dirt and smoke erupted across the target area as artillery rounds found their marks, and secondary explosions suggested that ammunition dumps and fuel storage areas were being hit. But she had been in enough combat operations to know that artillery, no matter how accurate or intense, could only do so much against a determined enemy in prepared positions. When the guns fell silent and her soldiers began their advance, they would still face whatever insurgent fighters had survived the bombardment, and those fighters would be angry, motivated, and fighting for their lives. Final equipment check. She called out to her platoon leaders. Make sure everyone has extra ammunition, water, and medical supplies. This is going to be a long day. Her company now consisted of 4 understrength platoons, totaling roughly 110 soldiers. They were supported by a section of engineers, a forward air controller, and a combat medic team, bringing their total strength to approximately 125 soldiers. Against an estimated enemy force of 300 fighters in prepared defensive positions, the odds were not encouraging. The approach march began at dawn, with her company moving in a tactical column through rocky terrain that offered concealment from enemy observation but limited their ability to maneuver quickly if they encountered resistance. The silence was oppressive. No bird songs, no distant sounds of civilian activity, just the muffled footsteps of soldiers and the occasional crackle of radio communications. "This feels like a setup," whispered Staff Sergeant Williams, who had resumed his position as her senior non-commissioned officer, despite his struggles with alcohol and survivor's guilt. "Too quiet, too easy." Sophia shared his concerns but kept her doubts to herself. Intelligence reports had indicated that enemy forces were concentrated around their primary defensive positions, but the absence of any security outposts or early warning systems suggested either phenomenal operational security or a carefully prepared ambush. The first sign of trouble came from Chun, who was monitoring enemy radio frequencies. "Ma'am, I'm picking up radio traffic that suggests they know we're coming. Multiple stations reporting movement in our sector." Before Sophia could respond, the world exploded around them. Hidden machine gun positions opened fire from multiple directions, while mortar rounds began impacting among her advancing soldiers. The carefully planned approach march dissolved into chaos as her troops dove for whatever cover they could find. In the rocky terrain, contact front, contact left, contact right. The reports flooded the radio frequency as squad leaders tried to make sense of the engagement and coordinate their response to the ambush. Through her binoculars, Sophia could see the scope of the trap they had walked into. Enemy positions were carefully integrated into the natural terrain, with interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach route into a killing field. Insurgent fighters had obviously spent weeks preparing their positions and had intimate knowledge of the terrain and likely coalition approach routes. "We're caught in the open with minimal cover," Williams reported, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Enemy has us bracketed with indirect fire, and their machine guns are preventing any movement." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Several soldiers were already wounded, and enemy mortar fire was becoming more accurate as spotters adjusted their fires. In another few minutes, her company would be combat ineffective, pinned in place and gradually destroyed by enemy fires. Sophia made the decision that would either save her soldiers or get them all killed. "All stations, this is 6. We're going to assault through the ambush. Fix bayonets and prepare to advance on my command." The radio fell silent for a moment before Williams's voice came back, tinged with disbelief. "Ma'am, did you say assault?" "Through the ambush?" "That's correct, Sergeant. The enemy expects us to go to ground and call for support. Instead, we're going to attack their positions before they can consolidate their advantage." It was the same tactical philosophy that had worked during their mountain engagement: use aggressive action to seize the initiative from an enemy who held all the apparent advantages. But this time, the stakes were higher and the enemy force was larger and better prepared. "All stations on my mark." Sophia shouted into her radio while rising from her covered position. "Charge!" What happened next would be studied in military academies for decades to come. Instead of the cautious, methodical assault that doctrine prescribed for attacking prepared positions, Sophia's soldiers charged directly at the enemy's strongest points with the kind of aggressive fury that had won battles throughout military history. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Enemy fighters who had been confidently engaging targets at long range suddenly found themselves facing soldiers charging directly at their positions with fixed bayonets and a kind of fanatical determination that turned rational tactical calculations into survival instincts. Thompson, who had recovered from his suicide attempt and returned to duty, was among the first to reach the enemy positions. His experience with combat stress had transformed him into a different kind of soldier, one who understood that survival depended on completing the mission regardless of personal cost. Martinez, the platoon medic who had been wounded multiple times but refused evacuation, charged through enemy fire to reach wounded coalition soldiers while simultaneously engaging enemy fighters with a rifle. Chun coordinated close air support with the same calm professionalism he had displayed throughout the deployment, walking Apache gunships steadily closer to enemy positions while directing artillery fires with pinpoint accuracy, but the cost was horrific. Within the first 10 minutes of the assault, Sophia had lost another 8 soldiers killed and 15 wounded. The survivors were advancing through terrain littered with the bodies of their friends, their uniforms soaked with blood and their weapons hot from sustained firing. "Keep moving. Don't stop," Sophia shouted as she led from the front, her rifle barking steadily as she engaged enemy positions. Around her, her soldiers advanced with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from extensive training and the knowledge that hesitation meant death. The breakthrough came when her second platoon, led by Lieutenant Marcus James, flanked around the enemy's left side and began rolling up their defensive positions from the rear. Enemy fighters, caught between multiple assault forces and subjected to continuous air and artillery support, began to break contact and retreat toward their secondary positions. "We've got them on the run," James reported over the radio. "Enemy forces are withdrawing to the east." But Sophia knew that the initial assault was only the beginning. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy had prepared multiple defensive lines with the initial positions designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. The real battle was yet to come. As her surviving soldiers consolidated on the captured positions and prepared for the next phase of the assault, Sophia looked around at what remained of her company. Of the 125 soldiers who had begun the operation, Only 67 were still capable of continued combat operations. The casualties included some of her most experienced non-commissioned officers and several soldiers who had been with the unit since her arrival in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Williams lay among the dead, his massive frame sprawled across an enemy machine gun position that he had single-handedly assaulted and destroyed. His final act had been to call in artillery fire on his own position to prevent enemy fighters from using the captured weapons against other coalition forces. The loss hit Sophia like a physical blow. Williams had been more than just her senior sergeant. He had been a mentor, a friend, and the kind of steady professional who held units together during the worst circumstances imaginable. His death represented not just the loss of an individual soldier, but the breaking of another link in the chain that connected her to the unit's shared history. "Ma'am," Lieutenant James said quietly, approaching her position with his helmet in his hands, "we need to reorganize and prepare for the next phase. Enemy forces are regrouping approximately 2 kilometers to our east." Sophia forced herself to focus on the immediate tactical situation rather than the growing list of casualties. Her surviving soldiers needed leadership now more than ever, and dwelling on losses would help no one. "What's our ammunition status?" "Critical. Most squads are down to less than 2 magazines per soldier. We've got enough medical supplies for immediate treatment, but several of the wounded need evacuation as soon as possible." The tactical picture was grim. Her company had achieved its initial objectives, but at a cost that left them barely capable of continued operations. Enemy forces were regrouping for counterattacks while her own forces were low on ammunition, high on casualties, and emotionally devastated by their losses. "Request immediate resupply and medical evacuation," she told Chun, who was monitoring multiple radio frequencies while coordinating with higher headquarters. "Ma'am, headquarters says no helicopter operations until we've secured the entire objective area. Enemy air defenses are still active, and they won't risk losing aircraft for resupply operations." The message was clear. Her soldiers were on their own until the overall operation was completed successfully. They would have to continue fighting with whatever ammunition they had left, treating their wounded with limited medical supplies, and somehow finding the strength to continue advancing against prepared enemy positions. As if to emphasize their precarious situation, enemy mortar rounds began impacting around their positions. The insurgent forces had reorganized more quickly than intelligence estimates had suggested, and they were already probing coalition positions for weaknesses. "Incoming!" someone shouted as mortar rounds walked steadily closer to their positions. Sophia dove for cover behind a pile of rubble, her mind racing through tactical options. They were too weak to continue the assault, too exposed to remain in their current positions, and too far from friendly forces to expect immediate support. Every choice carried significant risks, and every decision would have life or death consequences for her surviving soldiers. That was when she received the radio call that would define the rest of her military career. "Delta 6, this is Overwatch," came the voice of Colonel Barnes through the static. "Intelligence reports indicate enemy forces are massing for a major counterattack against your position. Estimated enemy strength is 200+ fighters with heavy weapons support. 200 fighters against her 67 effective soldiers, with no possibility of resupply or reinforcement." The tactical mathematics were simple and terrifying. "Sir, request permission to withdraw to more defensible positions," Sophia replied, knowing even as she spoke that withdrawal under fire would result in additional casualties they couldn't afford. "Negative, Delta 6. Your position is critical to the success of the overall operation. Higher headquarters has designated your objective as must hold, regardless of circumstances. I've been thinking about tomorrow's patrol. That area's been quiet lately, too quiet." "What are you thinking?" "Sergeant, in my experience, when insurgents go quiet, it's because they're planning something big. Could be they're letting us get comfortable before they spring a trap. Sophia nodded, her mind already working through the tactical implications. What would you recommend? Different route, maybe. Or at least some contingency plans if things go sideways. These boys have been through enough already. That evening, Sophia gathered her squad leaders for an additional briefing. Using satellite imagery and intelligence reports, they developed alternate routes and extraction plans for various scenarios. She emphasized the importance of situational awareness and established hand signals for silent communication in potentially hostile areas. Remember, she told them, our primary mission is intelligence gathering, but our first priority is bringing everyone home alive. Trust your instincts, watch each other's backs, and don't take any unnecessary risks. The patrol began before dawn, with Sophia's platoon moving in 2 columns through the dusty streets of Calaizal, a village of roughly 3,000 people nestled in a valley between rocky hills. The morning air was cool and still, carrying the sense of cooking fires and livestock. Children watched from doorways as the soldiers passed, their expressions curious but guarded. Sophia walked near the center of her formation, constantly scanning for threats while trying to maintain the kind of relaxed posture that wouldn't intimidate the local population. Through her interpreter, she spoke with village elders, asking about infrastructure needs and security concerns. The conversations were polite but uninformative. The villagers were friendly enough, but their answers had the practiced neutrality of people who had learned that taking sides in Afghanistan's endless conflicts was a good way to end up dead. By mid-morning, the patrol had covered roughly half of their planned route without incident. They had stopped at a small marketplace to distribute medical supplies and school materials when Chun's radio crackled with an urgent message from base. Delta 2-6, this is Overwatch. We've got movement on the eastern ridgeline. Looks like possible enemy observers with communications equipment. Sophia felt her blood chill. She keyed her radio while motioning for her soldiers to take defensive positions. Overwatch Delta 2-6. Can you confirm hostile intent? Negative at this time, but they've been tracking your movement for the last 20 minutes. Recommend you abort current mission and return to base. Before Sophia could respond, the world exploded into chaos. The first RPG round impacted against a nearby building, showering the marketplace with chunks of mud, brick, and debris. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions as insurgent fighters emerged from concealed positions throughout the village. Contact! Contact! Williams shouted into his radio. We're taking fire from multiple directions. Sophia's training kicked in automatically. Martinez, get the wounded to cover behind that truck. Chun, call for immediate close air support. Johnson, suppress those fighters on the rooftop. The firefight that followed would later be described in official reports as a brief but intense engagement with insurgent forces. For the soldiers caught in the crossfire, it felt like an eternity of terror and confusion. Bullets whined overhead, kicking up sprays of dirt and chipping away at the stone walls that provided their only protection. Private Thompson took a bullet in the shoulder but continued fighting, his rifle barking steadily as he engaged targets. On the surrounding rooftops, Corporal Rodriguez dragged a wounded Afghan civilian to safety, earning a gash across his forehead from flying debris in the process. Through it all, Sophia moved among her soldiers like a conductor directing a deadly orchestra. She coordinated fire support, managed ammunition distribution, and made the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Williams, take Chun and flank around to the south side of the mosque, she ordered, her voice calm despite the bullets cracking around her head. Martinez, how many wounded do we have? 3. All stable, the medic replied, her hands already working on Thompson's shoulder wound. But we need to get them out of here soon. The arrival of Apache helicopter gunships 20 minutes later turned the tide of the battle. The insurgent fighters melted away into the maze of buildings and alleyways, leaving behind several bodies at a marketplace scarred by war. As the dust settled and the adrenaline began to fade, Sophia looked around at her soldiers. Despite being outnumbered and caught in a well-planned ambush, they had performed with the kind of professional competence that would have made their instructors proud. More importantly, they had worked together as a team, each soldier trusting the others to do their jobs. "Outstanding work, everyone," she told them as they prepared to return to base. "You handled that like veterans." Rodriguez, a makeshift bandage covering the cut on his forehead, grinned at her. "Not bad for a babysitter, right, LT?" The comment that had been an insult 2 weeks ago now sounded like acceptance, maybe even affection. Sophia smiled back. "Not bad for a smartass from Brooklyn." The patrol's success earned Sophia her first commendation, and more importantly, the respect of her soldiers. But it also brought unwanted attention from higher headquarters. 2 days after the firefight, she was summoned to a meeting with Colonel Barnes, the battalion commander. Barnes was a career soldier in his late 40s, with the kind of squared-away appearance that suggested he still did push-ups every morning and pressed his own uniforms. His office was spartanly decorated, dominated by maps of the local area covered in colored pins and tactical overlays. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said without preamble, "I've been reading the after-action reports from your patrol. Impressive work. Under fire. Thank you, sir. My soldiers performed exceptionally. Indeed they did. Which is why I'm giving you a new assignment." Barnes moved to one of the wall maps, pointing to an area marked with red pins. "Intelligence suggests that insurgent forces are using this valley as a transit route for weapons and fighters moving between Pakistan and the main population centers. I want you to establish an observation post here and monitor enemy movement." Sophia studied the map, noting the remote location and difficult terrain. "How long would we be out there, sir?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "It's going to be rough, no resupply, except by helicopter, and the weather up there can be unpredictable. But the intelligence value could be enormous." As Barnes continued outlining the mission parameters, Sophia began to realize the true nature of the assignment. The observation post would be manned by a single platoon, isolated and vulnerable to attack. If insurgents discovered their position, her soldiers would be badly outnumbered with no hope of immediate reinforcement. It was exactly the kind of high-risk, high-reward mission that commanders usually gave to expendable units led by officers. They wouldn't mind losing. "Sir," she said carefully, "what's the enemy strength assessment for that area?" Barnes's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Intelligence estimates suggest company strength forces operating in the region, maybe more. A company typically consisted of 150 to 200 soldiers. Her platoon numbered less than 30. The math was not encouraging. "Understood, sir. When do we deploy?" 0600. "Tomorrow. Get some rest, Lieutenant. You're going to need it." That evening, Sophia gathered her squad leaders to plan the mission. They pored over topographical maps, satellite imagery, and intelligence reports, looking for the best positions and escape routes. The location Barnes had chosen offered excellent observation of the valley below, but it would also leave them exposed on 3 sides with limited cover from indirect fire. "This is a shit sandwich," Williams observed bluntly. "Pardon my French, ma'am, but whoever planned this mission either doesn't understand the terrain or doesn't care if we come back." "Maybe both," Rodriguez added grimly. "But if the LD's going, we're going. Right, boys?" The other soldiers nodded their agreement, and Sophia felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the harsh Afghan climate. These men, her men, were prepared to follow her into an almost certainly deadly situation because they trusted her judgment and leadership. The question was whether that trust was justified. The helicopter insertion at dawn was textbook perfect. The Black Hawk swooped low over the ridgeline, its rotors churning up clouds of dust and loose stone as Sophia and her platoon fast roped to the ground. Within 90 seconds, the aircraft was gone, leaving them alone in the vast silence of the Afghan mountains. The observation post they established looked like nothing more than a few scattered rocks and camouflage netting, but it had taken the better part of a day to construct. The position offered commanding views of the valley approaches while providing concealment from enemy observers. Hidden fighting positions covered all likely avenues of approach, and a well-camouflaged communications bunker maintained contact with headquarters. For the first 3 days, the mission proceeded exactly as planned. Sophia's soldiers maintained round-the-clock observation, carefully logging the movement of vehicles, pedestrians, and livestock through the valley below. Most of the traffic appeared to be legitimate farmers heading to market, nomadic herders moving their flocks to better grazing, children walking to the village school. But there were anomalies. Military-age men traveling in groups without women or children. Vehicles that changed direction abruptly when they spotted coalition aircraft overhead. Caravans that moved only at night, their routes carefully planned to avoid known observation points. "Contact at 270 degrees, whispered Specialist Chen from his position behind the spotting scope. 4 males, military age, carrying what looks like a K-47s. Sophia crawled to his position, accepting the scope and adjusting the focus. Through the powerful optics, she could see 4 men moving carefully through the rocks roughly 1,000 meters away. They were dressed in local clothes, but their movement patterns and tactical spacing suggested military training. "They're definitely not farmers," she murmured, making notes on her observation log. "Chun, get photos if you can." Over the next hour, they watched as the 4-man team established what appeared to be their own observation post on a ridge line across the valley. The position offered excellent views of the main road and would allow the insurgents to monitor coalition vehicle movements. "They're setting up to watch the watchers," Williams observed when Sophia briefed him on the situation. "Question is, do they know we're here?" That question was answered the following morning when Chun intercepted radio communications between enemy forces operating in the area. The insurgents were using a frequency that coalition forces had been monitoring, and their operational security was poor enough that the encrypted messages were easily broken. "Ma'am, you need to hear this," Chun said, offering her the headphones. The voice speaking Dari was calm and professional, clearly someone accustomed to giving orders. Through their interpreter's translation, Sophia learned that insurgent forces had identified the coalition observation post and were planning to attack within the next 48 hours. "How many fighters are we talking about?" she asked. Interpreter listened to several more transmissions before responding. "At least 60, possibly more. They're calling in additional forces from surrounding villages." Sophia felt her mouth go dry. 60 fighters against her 28 soldiers, and that was assuming the enemy intelligence was accurate. In her experience, insurgent forces tended to be larger than initial estimates suggested. She gathered her squad leaders for an emergency briefing, spreading the tactical map across a flat section of rock. "Gentlemen, we have a problem. Enemy forces have identified our position and are planning an attack. We have 2 options. Call for immediate extraction or stay and fight." "What does headquarters say?" Rodriguez asked. "I haven't contacted them yet. I wanted to get your input first." The 4 squad leaders exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that developed between soldiers who had served together under fire. Finally, Williams spoke for the group. "Ma'am, we've been getting some damn good intelligence from this position. If we pull out now, the enemy will just wait for us to leave and then go back to business as usual. But if we stay and fight, we might be able to hurt them bad enough to disrupt their operations for months. And if they overrun our position, then we'll make them pay for every inch," Tank Johnson said quietly. "These boys are ready for a fight, LT. Question is, are you?" It was a direct challenge, the kind that would define her relationship with these soldiers for the rest of their deployment. Sophia looked around at the faces watching her, seeing determination mixed with perfectly reasonable fear. These men were prepared to die for her tactical decisions, and they deserved a leader who was worthy of that sacrifice. "We stay," she decided, "but we do this smart. Williams, I want improved fighting positions and interlocking fields of fire. Rodriguez, work with Chun on calling for artillery support if things get bad. Johnson, you're in charge of ammunition, distribution and casualty collection. Questions?" There were none. Over the next 36 hours, Sophia's platoon transformed their observation post into a fortress. They improved their fighting positions with sandbags and additional camouflage, established backup communication systems, and carefully planned fields of fire that would channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. Most importantly, Sophia worked with Chun to establish communication protocols with close air support and artillery units. If her platoon was going to be outnumbered, they would need every advantage that superior coalition firepower could provide. The attack began just before dawn on their 7th day in the mountains. The first sign of trouble was the absence of birdsong. The normal morning chorus of wildlife that had become their natural alarm clock was conspicuously silent. "Movement at multiple positions," reported Private Thompson from his observation post. "Looks like they're trying to surround us." Through her binoculars, Sophia could see figures moving through the rocks and sparse vegetation, their approach coordinated and professional. These weren't the kind of poorly trained militia fighters that coalition forces sometimes faced. These men moved with the discipline of experienced soldiers. "All positions, this is 6, she whispered into her radio, using the military designation for commanding officer. "Enemy forces approaching from multiple directions. Hold your fire until I give the word." The waiting was the hardest part. Sophia watched through her scope as insurgent fighters moved closer to their perimeter, occasionally catching glimpses of weapons and equipment. She counted at least 40 fighters in the initial assault wave, with more likely held in reserve. At 200 meters, she made the decision that would either save her soldiers' lives or get them all killed. "All positions, open fire. Light them up." The morning erupted in violence as 28 soldiers opened fire simultaneously. The careful planning and preparation of the previous 2 days paid immediate dividends as the insurgent assault was channeled into predetermined kill zones where concentrated fire from multiple positions devastated their ranks. Johnson's machine gun chattered steadily, its heavy bullets punching through cover and forcing enemy fighters to seek better protection. Rodriguez and his team engaged targets with precise rifle fire while Chun coordinated air support requests with the calm professionalism of someone calling in a pizza order. The first enemy assault was repelled within 20 minutes, leaving at least 15 insurgent fighters dead or wounded in the rocks below their position. But Sophia knew this was only the beginning. The enemy commander would use the first attack to identify her defensive positions and plan his next move accordingly. "Casualties?" she called out. "Martinez took some shrapnel in the leg, but she's still mobile," Williams reported. "Thompson's got a graze on his arm. Everyone else is good to go." The respite lasted exactly 37 minutes. The second attack came from a different direction, with insurgent forces using smoke grenades and suppressive fire to mask their approach. This time, the enemy had rocket-propelled grenades and at least one heavy machine gun, weapons that could devastate her carefully prepared positions. "RPG!" someone screamed as the rocket-propelled grenade streaked toward Johnson's position. The Jambu explosion sent chunks of rock flying in all directions and temporarily silenced his machine gun. "Johnson, report." "I'm good, LT," came the slightly shaky response. "Gun's damaged, but I've got my rifle." With their primary automatic weapon out of action, Sophia's defensive fire was significantly reduced. The insurgent fighters pressed there, Advantage. Advancing under covering fire from their heavy machine gun positioned on a ridgeline roughly 800 meters away. Chun, where's our air support? Inbound in 6 minutes, ma'am. Apache gunships. 6 minutes might as well have been 6 hours. The enemy was already within grenade range of her forward positions, and she could hear the distinctive crack of a K-47. Rounds passing close overhead. In another minute or two, the insurgents would be close enough to overrun her positions through sheer weight of numbers. That was when Sophia made the decision that would earn her the Distinguished Service Cross and change the trajectory of her military career. All positions prepare to counterattack on my signal, she announced, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. We're going to hit them before they can consolidate their positions. Williams's voice came through the radio, tinged with disbelief. Ma'am, did you say counterattack? That's correct, Sergeant. Fix bayonets and prepare to assault. The concept of a platoon-sized unit conducting an aggressive counterattack against superior numbers violated every tactical manual Sophia had ever studied. But textbooks didn't account for the psychological impact of soldiers who were prepared to die rather than surrender their position. Follow me, Sophia shouted, rising from her fighting position and charging directly toward the advancing insurgents. What happened next would be debated in military academies for years to come. Instead of the coordinated withdrawal that the enemy commander expected, he suddenly found himself facing 28 soldiers, charging directly at his positions with fixed bayonets and the kind of aggressive fury that had won battles since warfare began. The counterattack shattered the insurgent assault like a hammer blow against glass. Caught completely off guard by the aggressive maneuver, enemy fighters found themselves engaged in close combat with soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of brutal, face-to-face fighting. Rodriguez reached the enemy's forward positions. First, his bayonet finding its mark in the chest of a fighter who had been reloading his rifle. Thompson, despite his wounded arm, tackled another insurgent and wrestled away his weapon before Chun finished the man with a precisely placed shot. The psychological impact was devastating. Insurgent forces that had been confidently advancing suddenly found themselves retreating in confusion, their carefully planned attack dissolving into chaos. Within minutes, the surviving enemy fighters were fleeing down the valley, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and more than 30 dead comrades. Secure the perimeter, Sophia ordered as Apache gunships arrived overhead, their chain guns chattering as they engaged fleeing insurgents. Collect enemy weapons and establish a casualty collection point. The aftermath revealed the true scale of their victory. Intelligence documents recovered from enemy bodies indicated that the attacking force had numbered nearly 80 fighters, including several experienced commanders from Pakistan and Chechnya. The loss of so many trained fighters, along with their weapons and equipment, would significantly degrade insurgent capabilities in the region for months to come. More importantly for Sophia, the successful defense established her reputation among the soldiers of Delta Company. Word of the platoon's stand spread quickly through the battalion, growing in the telling until it sounded like something from a Hollywood movie. The quiet lieutenant who had been given command of what everyone assumed was the expendable unit had not only survived impossible odds, but had led her soldiers to a decisive victory. Colonel Barnes's reaction to the after-action report was predictably complex. On one hand, the mission had achieved its intelligence objectives while inflicting significant casualties on enemy forces. On the other hand, Sophia's decision to counterattack rather than withdraw had violated standing orders and put her soldiers at unnecessary risk. Lieutenant Mitchell, Barnes said during her debriefing, your tactical judgment was sound, but your disregard for orders concerns me. When I tell you to withdraw, I expect you to withdraw, not charge the enemy like some medieval knight. With respect, sir, withdrawal would have resulted in higher casualties. The enemy had us bracketed with indirect fire and would have picked U.S. apart during a fighting retreat. That's not your decision to make. Your job is to follow orders, not second-guess your superiors. Sophia bit back her first response, which would have been career-ending. Instead, she nodded respectfully and accepted the formal reprimand that Barnes placed in her personnel file. The reprimand was balanced by a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, but the message was clear: she was being watched. The next several weeks passed in a blur of patrol operations, training exercises, and the kind of routine maintenance that kept soldiers busy between combat operations. Sophia used the time to strengthen relationships within her platoon and to study the tactical lessons learned from their mountain engagement. She also began to notice changes in how other units regarded her soldiers. Delta Company had always been considered competent but unremarkable, a solid B-plus unit that could be counted on to complete assigned missions without particular distinction. Now other platoons looked at them with the kind of respect reserved for elite units. The change was most noticeable in the younger soldiers throughout the battalion. Kids who had been intimidated by the prospect of combat began seeking out members of Delta Company, eager to learn from soldiers who had proven themselves in battle. Sophia found herself offering informal tactical instruction to lieutenants from other companies, sharing lessons learned from her combat experience. "You're becoming something of a legend," Captain Sullivan told her one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports in his office. "Half the battalion thinks you walk on water, and the other half thinks you're a dangerous loose cannon. What do you think, sir?" Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the kind of analytical gaze that career officers developed over years of evaluating subordinates. "I think you're the kind of leader who inspires people to do things they didn't know they were capable of. That's a rare gift, but it's also dangerous. Soldiers will follow someone like you into situations that more cautious leaders would avoid. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Depends on whether your judgment is good enough to deserve that kind of trust." The conversation was interrupted by Chun bursting through the door, his normally calm demeanor replaced by obvious excitement. "Ma'am, sir, we've got major problems," Chun announced breathlessly. Intercepted communications indicate a massive coordinated attack on Fob Chapman. They're talking about over 500 fighters, armor support, and surface-to-air missiles. Sullivan and Sophia exchanged glances. This wasn't the usual harassment or probing attacks they'd grown accustomed to. This was an all-out assault designed to overrun the base and inflict maximum casualties on coalition forces. "When?" Sullivan demanded. "Best estimate is within the next 6 hours. They're moving into position now." Colonel Barnes arrived within minutes, his face grim as he reviewed the intelligence intercepts. "This is it," he announced to the hastily assembled company commanders. "This is the big push we've been expecting. Intelligence estimates 500 to 800 fighters with mortar, rockets, and at least 3 captured Humvees rigged as vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices." The tactical situation was desperate. FOB Chapman housed roughly 1,200 coalition soldiers, but many were support personnel with limited combat training. The base's defensive positions had been designed to repel small-scale attacks, not withstand a coordinated assault by battalion-strength forces. "What's our defensive plan?" Captain Harrison asked. Barnes pointed to the base perimeter map. "We'll establish 3 defensive lines. The outer perimeter will delay and channel enemy forces into predetermined kill zones. The middle perimeter will be our main line of resistance, with interlocking fields of fire and artillery support. The inner perimeter will protect critical facilities and serve as our final fallback position." Sophia studied the map, noting that the outer perimeter would be manned by the most experienced combat units, including Delta Company. They would bear the brunt of the initial assault with minimal support, buying time for the base's heavier weapons to engage the attacking forces. "Delta Company will hold Sector 7, Barnes continued, indicating a section of the perimeter that faced the most likely avenue of enemy approach. You'll have approximately 200 meters of front to defend with your 3 remaining platoons. 3 platoons. Sophia's mind raced through the mathematics. After months of combat operations and casualties, Delta Company could field perhaps 90 effective soldiers. Against hundreds of attacking fighters, they would be overwhelmed within minutes, unless they could somehow multiply their effectiveness. "Sir," she spoke up, "request permission to establish forward observation posts beyond the outer perimeter. If we can identify enemy approach routes early, we can channel them into predetermined kill zones and maximize our artillery effectiveness." Barnes considered the proposal. That would require volunteers to man positions that would be cut off once the attack begins. Those soldiers would be on their own until the assault is repelled. "I'll lead the forward observation team myself," Sophia replied without hesitation. "Give me 12 soldiers and Chun for communications. We'll establish overlapping observation posts and coordinate fires until enemy forces overrun our positions." The silence that followed was broken by Sullivan's voice. "Mitchell, that's a suicide mission. You'll be completely exposed with no hope of extraction." "Maybe, but if we can break up their initial assault and force them to attack piecemeal rather, then in coordinated waves, we might buy enough time for air support to make the difference." Barnes studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Approved. Pick your team and deploy within the hour. And Lieutenant ... good luck." Sophia selected her volunteers carefully, choosing soldiers who had proven themselves under fire and who understood that they might not survive the night. Thompson volunteered immediately, his near-death experience having transformed him into someone who understood that some things were worth dying for. Martinez insisted on coming as their medic, despite having been wounded twice in previous engagements. Rodriguez was more direct in his approach. "LT, wherever you're going, Brooklyn's going with you. End of discussion." Chun, of course, was essential for coordinating artillery and air support. The remaining 8 volunteers were drawn from across the platoon, steady professionals who trusted their lieutenant's judgment even when it led them into impossible situations. They established 3 observation posts in a triangle formation, approximately 800 meters beyond the base perimeter, each position manned by 4 soldiers with radio communications and enough ammunition for a prolonged firefight. The positions were carefully camouflaged and offered excellent fields of observation while providing minimal cover from direct fire. The attack began at 2,147 hours with a coordinated mortar barrage against the base's outer defenses. Sophia watched through night vision scopes as enemy forces emerged from concealment, their movement patterns revealing the sophisticated planning behind the assault. "Overwatch, this is Delta Forward," she reported calmly into her radio. "Enemy forces approaching in company strength formations from multiple directions. Estimate 400+ fighters with crew-served weapons and vehicle support." The response was immediate. Artillery rounds began impacting among the advancing enemy formations, their high-explosive warheads creating gaps in the assault lines. But the insurgent forces had obviously anticipated coalition fire support, and they pressed their attack despite significant casualties. "Contact at Observation Post 3, Thompson reported. "We're taking direct fire from a heavy machine gun position approximately 600 meters southeast of our location." Through her scope, Sophia could see muzzle flashes from the enemy weapon as it raked their positions with sustained bursts. The accuracy suggested that enemy gunners had pre-planned their fires and knew exactly where the observation posts were located. "All posts, they know where we are," she announced. "Prepare for direct assault on our positions." What followed was 37 minutes of the most intense combat any of them had ever experienced. Enemy forces attacked all 3 observation posts simultaneously, while maintaining their advance on the base's outer perimeter. Sophia's 12 soldiers found themselves fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds while continuing to coordinate fire support for the base's defense. Rodriguez's position was overrun first, but not before he had called in artillery strikes that devastated an entire enemy platoon. His final radio transmission was characteristic. "Tell my ma I went out like a hero, LT, Brooklyn out." Martinez held her position for another 8 minutes, treating wounded insurgent prisoners, even while engaging their comrades with her rifle. Her medical training had taught her that all wounded deserved care, regardless of which side they fought for. Thompson's transformation from suicidal teenager to hardened warrior reached its completion in those final minutes. When his position was surrounded by enemy fighters, he armed 2 grenades and charged their positions, his final act saving Chun and Sophia from being overrun by 2,224 hours. Only Sophia and Chun remained alive in their forward positions. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, their radio equipment damaged by shrapnel, and enemy forces were closing in from all directions. But their sacrifice had achieved its purpose. The coordinated enemy assault had been broken up, forced to attack piecemeal against prepared defensive positions. "Chun, how's our communication with base?" "Spotty, ma'am. I can get through to artillery control intermittently, but the radio's pretty shot up." Sophia looked around at what remained of their observation post. Bodies of enemy fighters lay scattered in the rocks around their position, testament to the determined defense mounted by her soldiers. But more insurgents were advancing, and she could hear the sound of voices calling to each other in Dari as they coordinated their final assault. "Ma'am," Chun said quietly, "it's been an honor serving with you. Likewise, Specialist. Now let's make sure these bastards remember us." Their final stand lasted another 12 minutes. When ammunition ran out, they fought with knives and entrenching tools. When those were lost, they fought with rocks and bare hands. Security cameras later recovered from the observation post would show 2 soldiers refusing to surrender, refusing to retreat, and refusing to stop fighting until enemy forces finally overwhelmed their position. But their sacrifice had bought the base's defenders the time they needed. Apache gunships arrived overhead just as enemy forces reached the outer perimeter, their chain guns and Hellfire missiles turning the tide of battle. AC-130 gunships followed, their devastating firepower systematically destroying enemy formations that had been channeled into kill zones by the forward observers' reports. By dawn, the attack was over. More than 300 insurgent fighters lay dead around the base's perimeter, their bodies scattered among destroyed vehicles and abandoned weapons. The largest enemy offensive of the war had been defeated, broken by the courage of soldiers who understood that some things were worth dying for. Colonel Barnes stood in the makeshift morgue, looking down at the body of Lieutenant Sophia Mitchell. Her uniform was torn and blood-stained, her face peaceful despite the violent circumstances of her death. In her hand, she still clutched the radio handset she had used to coordinate artillery fires until the very end. "Sir?" Captain Sullivan approached. Quietly, "The casualty reports are ready for your review." Barnes nodded without looking up. "What's the count?" "Coalition forces, 23 killed, 47 wounded. Enemy forces, confirmed 312 killed, 63 captured, unknown number wounded. We recovered enough weapons and ammunition to equip 2 companies." The numbers told the story of a decisive tactical victory, but Barnes felt only the weight of loss. Delta Company had been virtually destroyed in the fighting, with casualties exceeding 70%. The soldiers who had followed Sophia Mitchell into hell had paid the ultimate price for their courage. "There's something else, sir," Sullivan continued. "The prisoners we captured. They're not talking much, but what they have said is interesting. They keep referring to Lieutenant Mitchell by name. Apparently, word of her previous engagements had spread through insurgent networks. They called her the devil woman who never retreats." Barnes finally looked up from Sophia's body. "She never did she? Even when retreat would have been the smart choice. Over the next several months, as official reports were filed and medals were awarded, the story of Sophia Mitchell's final battle became legend within military circles. The Distinguished Service Cross she was awarded posthumously joined the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Purple Heart she had earned during her deployment. But more importantly, her example inspired a generation of officers who understood that leadership meant more than giving orders and managing logistics. It meant being willing to sacrifice everything for the soldiers under your command. And for the mission that justified their sacrifice, Delta Company was reconstituted with new soldiers and officers. But they carried forward the traditions established by the soldiers who had died defending Forward Operating Base Chapman. The company guidon bore battle streamers recognizing their service, and new arrivals were told the stories of Rodriguez's humor, Thompson's transformation, Martinez's compassion, and Chun's unflappable professionalism. Most importantly, they were told about their lieutenant who had refused to leave her soldiers behind, who had led from the front in every engagement, and who had proven that true leadership meant inspiring others to be better than they thought they could be. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had died in the assault that opened this story, was posthumously promoted to Sergeant First Class. His family received not only his medals, but also letters from every soldier who had served under his leadership, describing how his example had shaped them as both soldiers and men. Corporal Rodriguez's family in Brooklyn held a memorial service that was attended by more than 200 people, including soldiers who had served with him and civilians who had never met him but understood what his sacrifice represented. His mother kept his final radio transmission on a recording that she played whenever she needed to remember her son's courage. Private Thompson's transformation from troubled teenager to heroic soldier became part of the official Army narrative about how military service could redeem even the most damaged individuals. His parents, who had feared they would lose their son to suicide or addiction, instead received a folded flag and the knowledge that he had died saving his fellow soldiers. Elena Martinez's story inspired dozens of young women to enlist as combat medics, drawn by her example of combining fierce combat skills with unwavering compassion. A scholarship in her name was established at her alma mater, supporting students who wanted to pursue careers in military medicine. David Chun's technical expertise and calm professionalism under fire became the gold standard for military communications. Specialists Training scenarios used in schools were based on his actions during the various engagements, teaching new soldiers how to maintain critical communications under the most challenging circumstances. But it was Sophia Mitchell's legacy that had the most lasting impact. The leadership principle she embodied, leading by example, never asking soldiers to do something you wouldn't do yourself, and placing the mission and your people above your own career advancement, became part of the formal curriculum at officer training schools. Young lieutenants studying her tactics learned that aggressive action could overcome superior numbers when combined with thorough planning and unwavering determination. They learned that soldiers would follow leaders who demonstrated genuine care for their welfare and who shared their risks and hardships. Most importantly, they learned that true leadership wasn't about rank or authority, but about inspiring others to achieve something greater than themselves. Years later, when veterans of the Afghan War gathered to remember their fallen comrades, they would tell stories about the lieutenants and sergeants and corporals who had shaped their understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. They would speak with pride about units that had achieved impossible victories, and with sorrow about friends who had paid the ultimate price for their courage. But among all those stories, one name would be mentioned with particular reverence: Lieutenant Sophia Mitchell, who had proven that size and strength mattered less than determination and heart, and who had shown that sometimes the most unlikely leaders could inspire the most extraordinary acts of heroism. The mountains of Afghanistan are littered with the remnants of armies that thought superior numbers guaranteed victory. What they failed to understand, and what Sophia Mitchell embodied in every decision she made, was that wars are won not by the largest force, but by the soldiers who refuse to quit when quitting would be easier than fighting. Her story reminds us that leadership isn't about the rank on your collar or the authority of your position. It's about the willingness to stand up when others sit down, to advance when others retreat, and to sacrifice your own safety for the people who have chosen to follow you. In a world that often seems dominated by those who seek power for its own sake, Sophia Mitchell's example shows us what true leadership looks like: humble, courageous, and always focused on something greater than personal advancement. She was 5'4" and weighed barely 130 pounds. She had been underestimated by her peers, questioned by her superiors, and given command of a unit that others considered expendable. But she proved that when 500 soldiers are willing to follow you through hell, it's not because of your rank or your authority. It's because you've shown them that you would do the same for them. That's the kind of leader the world needs more of. And that's the kind of story that reminds us why some battles, no matter how impossible they seem, are still worth fighting. If Sophia Mitchell's story moved you, if it made you think about leadership, courage, and sacrifice in new ways, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who would appreciate this kind of in-depth storytelling. Your support makes it possible for me to continue creating these epic narratives that bring history's most remarkable figures to life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. We have so many more incredible tales of heroism, leadership, and human triumph waiting to be told, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, remember that the most extraordinary heroes are often the most ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.